Thank you, Cleve. It's great to be here at the Howenstein Center in Grand Valley. And we're going to talk about pocketbook predictions for presidential elections. And I have my colleague Ilhan Gekkel here. That's him smiling with the old-fashioned style of tie right there. He's sitting in the front. So, and in 2004, and again this year, we've done this particular model, and we're going to talk about it today. And here's our overview. We're going to just introduce a little bit about Ilhan and I and why we do this. We're going to ask the question, are voters predictable? And we're going to say, how do pocketbook issues affect voter preferences? How does a pocketbook model predict past elections? And then finally, drum roll, what do we think is going to happen this year? Just a little bit about Ilhan and myself. Cleve gave a very nice introduction. Our firm does work all over the country, mostly with businesses, private sector. Here in Grand Rapids, a couple of our clients, Myers, Grand Rapids Chamber, and Experience Grand Rapids. You might have seen the work we did on the Art Prize recently. This is a great town. We like to visit it. And Ilhan Gekkel is also a co-author with me with Applied Game Theory and Strategic Behavior. And there is a lot of this in campaigns. So this is a little bit about our firm. And as Cleve said, we do work all around the country, quite a bit in Michigan, but in other places as well. And that's helpful because, of course, Michigan's not the only place that elects the president. The rest of the country does too. Okay, are voters in the U.S. predictable? That's the first question. We think voters in a republic like the United States of America should be rational, at least as a group. Not that every single person is rational. You can disprove that any day of the week just by listening to talk radio or going online. But selecting a candidate that you believe will improve your life or represent your values is a very rational thing to do. And of those things that improve your life, economic well-being is clearly one of the most important. Pocketbook issues are those issues that directly affect your economic well-being. Your family budget, your ability to earn money, whether or not you have a job, how much your paycheck is worth, and how far you can go with it. And our pocketbook model says the following. We have a theory. Our theory is that economic well-being is the dominant measure of voter satisfaction. That voters that are happy with their economic well-being will reward the incumbent party with their votes. This is very easy. Everybody that goes into a voting booth, it says Republican or Democrat. You have a really good idea who the incumbent is. Often, usually it's the incumbent's on, but even if the incumbent's not on the ballot, you have a good idea who the party of the incumbent was, and you can directly reward or punish them. Now, other factors do explain voting behavior. We know that. And what we're going to do here is we're going to look only at those economic and institutional factors and see how well they predict the model. And this is, in fact, our test. We're going to look back at past elections. We'll put together a model. Is it true that voters reward the incumbent's party with their votes when the economy does better, basically without regard to everything else? And so let's see what happens. Now, okay, just some limitations. We're trying to explain voter decisions, not guide them. I know a few of you all have strong opinions about who you're voting for, and you can decide who you're voting for. We believe voters should consider things like a philosophy of the candidate, their character, their policy positions, their party affiliation. Not only do we think they should, we know they do. What we're going to do is do the best with a statistical model, see how much we can explain, and we know that people will make decisions even outside that model. Okay, how well? Well, Cleve seems to think we did well enough to invite us back, but it did take 8 years. So let's see, how well? Well, let's study the rational voter. We looked at the U.S. economy and U.S. presidential elections using data from 1912 through 2008. Now, we have economic data on the United States that goes back actually all the way to the Revolution, but the best data is since 1948, so we have the most accurate there. We have some older data as well. And we have very good state-level economic and voting data since 1980. And one of the things that we do that some of the other folks that have tried this haven't done is we try to also look at states, because states are different and states make decisions a little bit differently. People in Michigan don't think the same way as people in Ohio, which all of us U of M grads are constantly reminding ourselves. But you know, people in different states make different decisions. And we compared the share of the votes gained by the incumbent party to those gained by the major challenging party. So for this year we'll look at the incumbent Democratic candidate versus whoever the Republicans put up, presuming that that's the major candidate and major party. And we look at the difference between those and we try to explain this. This is consistent with our theory that voters reward or punish the incumbent party. Now, if we look back, and we're going to show you how this is, early in the 20th century, elections were all over the map. We're used to intensely fought elections. Often our elections come out to 2 or 3 percentage points. You look back earlier in the century, that wasn't the case. These were wild and woolly elections. You had new parties coming in. Regional differences were strong. Religious prejudices were strong. You have a lot of things that made elections swing wildly earlier in the century. Since the 1950s, around that time, two parties have consistently dominated the election, and you have the emergence of what are called limited wars. We had World War I, World War II. We've obviously had wars before then, and there was a rally around the commander-in-chief type of reaction that you can clearly see, particularly during World War II. Since the Vietnam era, we've had limited wars, but other than that new change, institutional factors have generally been stable since the 1950s. This lets us do a nice, clear comparison. And we looked at just 5 of these variables. All the many, many things that people think about, we boiled it down to 5. One was income. Do people have more income? Obviously, if you really want to get technical about it, you'd look at what economists call real disposable income after tax, after inflation. We looked at GDP for the country as a whole. We looked at gross state product for individual states. What did we expect? This one's pretty easy. We expect that more income means more votes for the incumbent. That's what we think is going to happen here. And then we took a look at inflation and said, if inflation's growing, that's raising the prices. And deflation as well. If you look back during the Great Depression, you saw deflation, and by some measures during the recent Great Recession, there was times of deflation also. That also tends to hurt people. Taxes affect also their ability. Number one, income growth. Number one variable, income, gross domestic product, gross state product. Number 2 variable is employment. Growing unemployment unnerves voters. This is probably the best known economic statistic. Probably only a handful of you can tell me what the US GDP is, but probably everybody has a pretty good idea of what the unemployment rate is. We expect fewer jobs, fewer votes. That's what we think the voters will do. Number 3, we mentioned inflation. Inflation takes away purchasing power. We expect high inflation means fewer votes. A modest amount of inflation, we don't expect that that's going to cost the incumbent party votes. Deflation, like you saw during some years in the Great Depression, and you saw actually recently we had some deflation, fewer votes. War. U.S. voters rallied around the commander-in-chief during the full-scale wars, World War I, World War II, even the Korean War. But voters have had a different view of limited wars, particularly ones that went on for a while. We expect that limited wars that last more than a short time will mean fewer votes. Then finally, an institutional factor, is there a major third-party candidate that's on the ballot in multiple states and takes a significant number of votes? Now this is something that we don't know for sure because we don't have people that have filed. We don't know who's on the ballot. But we can clearly look back and see Perot in 1992. Obviously, if you look all the way back, you see Teddy Roosevelt creating a whole new party, basically. We expect significant third-party candidates can split the vote that would otherwise go to one of the major parties. So this is an institutional factor. It's not something that the economy generates, but it's something that we had to take into account. And one thing, the way that we looked at this also, we looked at those 5 variables, but we also tried to think about what we call the good news factor. We think that voters are going to have memories like everyone else's memory that is kind of short. And things that happened recently are going to be more vivid to them and have a stronger effect on their behavior. So we think that economic improvement or decline in an election year will matter more than results in previous years. And of course, when you're measuring these different things, you could look at GDP growth for the entire term or just the last year. We're trying to look for ways to recognize that people are looking at what have you done for me lately type of analyses of the economy. A couple examples, so for example, the Bush-Clinton 1992 election. In the last year, it was a very good term for the economy, but in the last year we had a weak recession. And of course, you look in 1980, terrible economy. And Clinton-Dole, very good economy. 1996, strong economy. And all of these went in a way that you might have started to suspect had you look at the last year of the economy. Okay, what factors did we exclude? We gave you the 5 factors that we included. What did we exclude? We deliberately excluded a number of factors that clearly help predict election results. No polling data, no sentiment data, no, do you approve of the job that the president's doing? There's nothing in our model for this. No partisan affiliation. You think the Republicans or Democrats better represent your views? Nothing of that's in the model. Things like union membership, public sector employment, things like that clearly matter to voters and help predict the vote. We excluded all of that. And then campaign expenditures, debate performances, clever advertising, hanging Chad, all of it out of the model. Why do we do that? Because we're trying to not only just predict. If all you want to do is get your best prediction, wait till the last poll the day before. Of course, then it's the least interesting too. If what you're trying to do is figure out why and how voters make their decisions, you look at this. Come up with something that you think matters and try to distinguish how much of effect that has on voters. So here, our entire effort is to try to isolate the effect of pocketbook issues in the pocketbook model, knowing full well that voters can and do think of other things. All right, so now the money slide. How well did our pocketbook model predict the outcome of previous elections? My co-author's not nervous. You know what's coming up, right? Okay. Well, let's look at the econometric model. 5 key variables: income, employment, inflation, war, third-party candidates. Economic data since 1912 and detailed data from the 20 largest states since 1980. Deliberately exclude polling, partisan identification. That's all out. None of it's in there. And then we use an econometric model using a variation of a standard statistical technique. There is no test here, so, okay, but one that will be familiar with a lot of folks, linear regression. We actually do some pretty fancy stuff involving different states where the standard models don't work really well, but this is all based on just standard econometrics. And then we compare the results. We're actually trying to give ourselves, well, is this of any use? If you look at opinion polls taken about 6 months before the election, and we've gone back and looked, these are often off by 7%, 10% or more. It's not the sampling error that they report. This poll's, they report on TV, this poll's accurate within 3%. That sampling error is based on the pollster's own estimate of how good they would be if they actually asked every single person in America as opposed to just the 800 they asked. It's not a question of the error between then and the rest of the time, because people could change their mind, or they might not have told the truth, or they might not have been asked. Typically, you look at national opinion polls out 6 months or a year, even less than that. They're often off. I went back and looked, for example, at 2004, and in 2008. If you went out 1 month and 2 months before, you saw the person that lost equal or ahead. So in various national opinion polls. So if we get within about 7%, we think we're doing at least as well as pollsters, at least 6 months out. Okay. How well do we do? Well, we did a modestly good job from 1960 to 1960, and we did a very good job from 1960 to 2008. The model as a whole explains about 75% of the variation in popular votes. And I think that was basically what we found when we were here before, 8 years ago. That means about 3/4 of the decisions that people are making, whether to favor the incumbent or not, are explained with just these 5 factors. It correctly picks the popular vote winner of every election since 1980, including 96, including 2000, 2004, 2008, even 1992, which I said earlier, very hard to look at that, where you have a Ross Perot coming in and taking a large number of votes. And if you look back, it correctly picks the popular vote winner in 21 out of the past 24 elections. Now you might ask yourself, well, what were the 3 we got wrong? Okay, so we're going to show you, we're going to show you the graph all the way from 1916 all the way to 2008. 2 bars for every election. Green is the actual, blue is the predicted. And here's the results. And I'll actually come over here because I want to talk about a couple of these. So here's this wild swings. Look at these election results earlier in the century. Boom, boom, boom. 30%, 20%, 10%. Huge swings. Then you get up here, 1948, I'm just talking about it. This is the famous Chicago Tribune headline of Dewey beats Truman, held up by Truman, the winner. The model says probably should keep the incumbent. Voters agreed. Now we get to 1952. This is the first time we're off. 1952. Voters have had Democrats since 1928. Okay, so they had a lot of Democrats. 1952, Cold War tensions, and you had the chance to elect Dwight D. Eisenhower, or you could have had Adlai Stevenson. Okay, the pure economy said you stick with Adlai Stevenson. The voters said we like Ike. I can't argue with the voters back there. So, all right, 1956. All right, they're familiar with Ike now, and we're right on target. And basically, economy says re-elect the incumbent. Voters say re-elect the incumbent. 1960 is another one where we got this is tiny. You can hardly see it. The pure pocketbook model says, you know, we ought to be switching here, or we ought to be sticking with the Republicans. Voters narrowly, still disputed some parts of it, picked the Democrat. Now I would think, why? Some of you may know this, but in 1960, John F. Kennedy actually ran to the right of Nixon, the missile gap. He was stronger on defense, and he was a war hero. So, and later on, Kennedy actually was involved in tax cuts. So this was a different kind of Democrat, but nonetheless, in 1960, you saw an example, and this was the first real TV election. Charismatic candidate, media savvy, media like JFK, and that particular one, Pocketbook said probably Nixon wins. Voters said Kennedy wins. 1964, no, it wasn't the bad speeches, it wasn't the commercials, it wasn't extremism in the pursuit of virtue. It was the economy, according to this. If the economy is doing that well in 1964, the Pocketbook model says you keep the incumbent. Voters agreed. 1968, clearly a wild time, terrible year in many respects. Economy said you should be changing. Voters said we're changing. 1972. Now, we knew about Watergate, but it's kind of recent. 1972, economy's terrific. Boom. Now, McGovern on the other side, voters were stronger in favor of the Republican incumbent than the model predicted, but clearly on the same side. And then we'll go to the last one, 1976. And of course, we're here in Gerald Ford's hometown. What a great man, Gerald Ford. Economy says, keep Gerald Ford. Pocketbook voters would have normally kept Gerald Ford, but of course, that was a very, very unusual year, and voters had a chance to punish the Republican Party, and they did. And this is near and dear to a lot of people's hearts because Jerry Ford's a wonderful man. Passed away just recently, a great guy, great American, great son of Michigan. Economy said we should keep Gerald Ford. And then we can look ahead. We're going to talk about some of the other ones, but obviously 1980. The misery index. Terrible year economically, and voters totally agreed. It wasn't just debate performance. The economy said, change courses, and the voters agreed. So that's the track record here. I'm just going to take a few looks. We just talked about the 3 elections where the Pocketbook prediction was incorrect. This is interesting. If you have a really good model and you're honest, that means you're not going to always explain what voters do, but the exceptions can sometimes really tell you. What does it take? What does it take to get voters to go in an opposite direction from their pocketbook? It's years like this. Okay, let's just talk about the last 3 presidential elections. Bush versus Gore, Bush versus Kerry, and McCain versus Obama. Just do a close-up. 2000, 2 new candidates. Gore was the VP, Bush was the Texas governor. 1990s were economic boom years. Low inflation, low unemployment. If you're watching the debates now, it's very interesting that we have a Republican candidate that talks about the Gingrich-Clinton years, I think, if that's the discussion of it, how great the 1990s were. And there were really good years. In 2000, there was a mild recession. And there was a third-party candidate, didn't take a lot of votes, but it was active in a couple states. The Pocketbook model says that the popular vote should favor very narrowly the incumbent. And in fact, that's what happened. So we actually predicted, the model here predicts a narrow popular vote margin. And that's what happened. Bush won the Electoral College. And of course, we're a republic. We have a constitution. It says Electoral College. For good reasons, Bush won the election. 2004, incumbent President Bush presided over an economic recovery, income growth, low unemployment, had limited wars going on. The model correctly predicted a small margin win for the incumbent. Okay? It wasn't his fractured syntax or mine. It wasn't anything else. The economy said we ought to re-elect him. Voters did. And then 2008. Okay, 2 new candidates. They're both U.S. senators. Incumbent party presided over an economic downturn that began late in the term. Most of that, the last term was good, but the last year was not. That downturn later became the Great Recession. In the election year, stock market crashed, a huge bailout bill was passed, unemployment was rising. This was not a close call for pocketbook voters. Pocketbook voters were likely to say, change course, give me a new captain, and they did. Okay, so that's our track record for the past, 21 out of 24, and everyone since 1980. What about 2012? Well, let's look. Let's look at our assumptions right now. And of course, we're only 1 month and 7 days into the new year. But we have an idea of what's going to happen. And when we were here 8 years ago, we were in the spring. So one of the interesting things about this is generally when the economy gets started in a year, you've got a pretty good idea. You can be surprised. And clearly, for example, 2008 got much, much, much worse during the later part of the year. But generally, we're pretty good at predicting what is going to happen to an economy during the year. Most economists can predict within 1 or 2% real GDP growth. I mean, 7 out of 8 years, even 9 out of 10. So that part of this is something that we're able to do fairly well. We can be surprised, but here's our assumptions. Income growth, stagnant, but it is positive. We think the economy is growing. We're not predicting another double-dip recession. We think the economy is getting better. Employment. Unemployment will be high. 8.3% is high. But it's dropping. It's not 10%. It's not 9%. It's dropping. And remember what I said about good news. People tend to take into account how things have been recently. Inflation. Depending on how you look at it, inflation is either very low or rising. And we've looked at consumer price index inflation, measured inflation. So we're looking at how consumers view it, how it affects their pocketbook. Right now, inflation is actually creeping up, measured by the CPI. So we're looking at some inflation kicking up. I had a discussion earlier about price of gas. Prices of different things that consumers buy are very sensitive in terms of consumer reactions to those, and those are ticking up. War. There's two painful limited wars that have been going on in Iraq and Afghanistan. In one, we were formally out of Iraq. Afghanistan, the defense secretary said, well, we'll probably be there till 2013. All right, so these are winding down. It's kind of hard for us, institutional factor here, to know for sure. And obviously a lot of talk now about different things. And just like every election year for the past 10 or 15 or 20 years, the Middle East is still a powder keg. But right now we're expecting that we're seeing limited wars winding down. Third party, this is, I think, the one that's the most out from left field. Right now there's no third party that looks like they're going to take a lot of votes and be on the ballot in multiple states. But a lot of those Ron Paul supporters are out there talking about it, whether Ron Paul is or not. So it's not likely, but it could happen. Okay, so predicting the 2012 election. What does the Pocketbook model say? Okay, here's the scorecard. Income growth, negative. Loses the incumbent votes. Unemployment, strong negative. It's coming down, but it is high. 8% is high. Inflation, about neutral. It's not crept up yet to the point where it's really costing a lot. War, neutral to negative right here. We don't really know yet whether we're going to have a limited war going on, to what extent. But right now I'd say this neutral to negative. And third party, we're saying neutral. Right now we're assuming there's no third party on the ballot. What does that mean? That means Pocketbook voters will likely vote against the incumbent party. And our prediction then, based on that, Pocketbook model says incumbent president would not be elected in 2012. If the economy stays sluggish, no third-party candidate materializes. Actually, the margin is likely to be 3% or more, which is fairly large by recent standards. Now, this prediction is based on past voting behavior. Obviously, this is what the voters have done in the past. What we've done is distill what they've done, and our best guess for the 2012 economy as of February 2012. We don't even know the name of the Republican candidate. The last two big state primaries, the candidate that was ahead in the polls the week before lost in both Florida and South Carolina. Sooner or later, both parties will pick a candidate, but right now we're not even sure for the Republican Party, pretty sure for the Democratic Party. Of course, things could change before the election. Let's just look at what we think might change. Well, number one, the economy could be strong and swing the election back. And just look at the most recent unemployment numbers. You got people chattering about the economy may be coming back faster. We're expecting on the whole about 8% unemployment for the year. It's still above that. So I think our best guess is that unemployment does come down. If it comes down a lot faster than we think, this is clearly something that would swing Pocketbook voters back toward the incumbent. Number two, a third-party candidate could emerge. This is probably the biggest nightmare if you're a Republican political strategist, is that you're very concerned about a third-party candidate, about a Ross Perot type situation. And of course, voters might vote or they might not show up to signal frustration, anger, outrage. And of course, we've had reasons for them to be frustrated, angered, and outraged. That doesn't fit into any rational voter model, although signaling your frustration and anger and outrage does, and we are capturing that in the past. But there's always a chance, like in 1976, like in 1952, where voters see something completely outside the economy. They say they don't like that or they like something else. And it doesn't happen that often, but every once in a while it does. All right, I'm going to talk for a minute about two analogous elections. Now, these are both landslide elections. We know the outcome here. But they're very instructive about 2012. And I'm going to talk about why. 1936. This is FDR's first re-election campaign. The economy is still in what we call the Great Depression. But if you were there in 1936, you would say, well, the stock market crashed in 1929, and then things got better. We elected that different guy, fireside chats. Things are getting better. And in fact, in 1936, things were getting better. And they're getting better pretty fast. And although people tend to forget this now, because history tends to say, oh, that was the era we did this, and that was the era of the New Deal. That was the era of dramatic expansion of government programs, many of which are still with us, some of which were declared unconstitutional and are gone. But in 1936, a lot of the most intrusive ones were not yet implemented. So if you think about it, I think the Social Security Act was passed, but we hadn't started quite doing everything that we're familiar with. We didn't have the wage price controls. So 1936 is a year where FDR is there, and of course a masterful politician. The economy is getting better, and the incumbent wins a landslide election in the midst of what we would call the Great Depression today. Instructive. All right, 1980, Jimmy Carter's re-election campaign. High unemployment and big inflation led to the misery index. Misery index was add unemployment and inflation. And the misery index was miserable in 1980. High unemployment, high inflation. Reagan promised a sharp change in leadership. Well, that was for sure. In fact, that was the complaint about Reagan. He was going to provide too sharp a change. In fact, there were talks about him being dangerous, old, out of touch, and Jimmy Carter at least had been our commander-in-chief for a while. Of course, Jimmy Carter had been surprised by the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, and he was seen as having weak leadership. What happened here? Well, we know what happened here. Ronald Reagan won a landslide election. Now, I'm bringing these two up because they're both situations that I think will be used as metaphors in 2012. Because if you think about it, FDR, transforming America, big new social programs, well, there's something of a ring to that if you're the Democrat incumbent. Great Depression, Herbert Hoover. Even though Herbert Hoover wasn't on the ballot, we kind of think of the Great Depression as being there with Herbert Hoover. So if you wanted to have a negative view of that, you might bring up that. And look at 1980. I mean, the country still loves Ronald Reagan. Strong leadership, decisive turn to a different direction, and perhaps a romanticized version, but that Ronald Reagan vision is still a very strong one. And of course, Jimmy Carter, trying to do things in seemingly ineffective, hapless, distracted, unable to deal with the Soviet Union and other challenges. I'm not saying these are all true, I'm saying these are all handy metaphors. So I think you're going to be hearing metaphorically about 1936 and about 1980, even though you may not hear about it directly. Right now, if you have to choose between these 2 years, it looks more like 1980. But then I haven't started listening to campaign commercials yet. So. Okay, thank you, Grand Valley.
We have 2 microphones up at the front, and if you have a question, please approach the microphones. And Professor Anderson will call it.
Yes, all right, okay. We have a ringer up first, okay.
Does the national debt show itself in some way in the factors, or is that even considered? Would our current national debt show itself in income growth in some way, or in unemployment, or does the model just not look at the current national debt?
A good question about a big economic issue for a lot of voters, the national debt. And people have a reason to be concerned about that, whether or not they're looking at Greece and other countries. The short answer is no. And the model that Mr. Getchkill and I put together here, we're just looking at how voters are right now. So if it hasn't affected their pocketbook yet, it doesn't show up in the model. Now that doesn't mean they're not thinking about it, and it might be nice if we turn back. I'm going to see if I can get that slide where we have all those elections. If you want to look where voters decisively changed course, 1980 is one. I mean, they decisively changed course. Their current pocketbooks were hurting, right? But they also saw that, you know, this direction isn't good for us. We don't seem to have a way out. Whereas if you look in other elections, I mean, 1984, they clearly liked the direction. And in 1984, around this time, one of the criticisms of the Reagan economic plan was that you would see deficits as far as the eye can see into the future. That was a criticism. You get up here, we actually had a balanced budget. All right? And I look here and see these results, and I end up thinking that whatever the per capita debt didn't affect what people thought nearly as much as did they have a job, did they have more income, and did they have some confidence that we're on the right track. So now you go out here to 2012, obviously our debt problem has gotten very, very bad very, very fast. I mean, it's not too long ago that we had a balanced budget in the United States. Our debt to GDP ratio is now just breached 100%. I have in one of my other slides about the economy, which is not nearly as interesting as this, by the way. I put up the list of the countries that have debt to GDP ratios like the United States. There are places like Latin American countries, like new African countries, third world countries, countries without well-developed economies, and known quite profligate countries. Greece is well above us. I think they're like 160%, but basically above 90%, you're in the danger zone. We're at 100% now. So if in fact this starts to hit people's pocketbooks, it will definitely affect them. And if it's just a fear that they have, it doesn't show up in the model, but will affect other things.
You made reference to the great political skills of FDR. What are the political skills that he used in 1936 that we could be looking for to be applied now? Emily Schlaze, for instance, says that he personally approved every WPA project, including the Civic Auditorium across the street. What should we look for that the president can pull out to live up to those skills?
That's a very good question, and one of the reasons I think 1936 is such a metaphorical election, metaphorical, I'm not sure it's the dominant metaphor, but it's clearly a metaphor, is something that's exactly like this. And I want you to think back. Remember when we did the major stimulus program under the current administration? Does anybody remember what the most immediate, visible expenditure of money was? It was those signs saying, your tax dollars at work, the American Recovery Act. I saw lots and lots of those signs, all right? And the signs told you that, you know, help is on the way from Washington, D.C. We are from Washington, and not only are we going to help you, we're helping you right now. That was the political message. Somewhere somebody actually toted up the amount of money that went into the signs. I think that's straight. I mean, that's the straight example going back. I mean, I'm sure FDR wasn't the first one to invent pork barrel politics or bringing home the bacon or the public works projects. Probably the pharaohs in Egypt, and they probably might have been the first one with the public works projects. Maybe the Mayans, who knows? But they clearly predated the United States of America. But that's number one there. And it's also interesting, the other side of that is there's a little bit of debate about how to count unemployment back in the 1930s, actually, because you have a lot of people that are in WPA and other jobs. There were government jobs, and it wasn't clear whether they were employed or unemployed in the classic sense. Okay.
Well, I have a question for you.
All right.
I'm curious.
Another ringer.
If the Obama administration or any of the candidacies out there have approached you and wanted to study what your model, your award-winning model shows.
I'd like this to sink in for a little bit. Now, why don't they do it? No one's approached us about this, and I'll tell you one of the reasons why. First of all, this is unsettling if you're a political professional. You spend a lot of time on polling, strategy, you know, what color tie the candidate should wear. Obviously, no one asks me what tie the candidate should wear in debates. And then you have these economists come up and explain 3/4 of what happens 6 months ahead of time. All right, so this undercuts your view of yourself as a mastermind, things like that. It shouldn't really, because even if we're explaining only 75%, there's still an awful lot going on. And there are elections that are decided at 0.5%. And there are elections like 2000, where the popular vote went one way and the electoral vote went another. So I think one reason is that they really like, you know, people that are involved in this like to think other things are important. And then second, the other way to look at this is, especially since 1992 and James Carville's famous phrase, "It's the economy, stupid," people get that this is important. They haven't seen it really put out this often. This is a novel way to look at it. What Ilhan and I have done here is interesting. The Hauenstein Center's, you know, given a chance for a national audience to see it. I wouldn't be surprised, though, if you saw something like this used in the future to target what states to go after. We've presented the national model here. We didn't present separately a state model, but when you look at states, you do in fact see that there's ways to target your efforts. And that, if I was going to guess, I think that's where this would be used in the future. Mr. Mayor.
Patrick, it's nice to have you back in Grand Rapids. He and I worked together 20 years ago on a Blue Ribbon Commission appointed by Governor Engler. I have two questions for you. You're an economist, and I respect your acumen and your detail. There are some wild cards going on in the race today, and if I can move you out of your comfort zone to talk a little larger than the economic impact. Two of the most significant things that I've seen recently are the nastiness in the Republican primaries and the tone it has set, and whether or not you agree with me that it's going to get even nastier in the general election because of the power of number two, the Citizens United decision opening up the door to unregulated and unreported amounts of money is going to change the dynamic. I wonder if either of these two factors might have an impact, one way or the other, on your economic analysis.
All right, good question. So first, nasty campaigns, and second, unregulated money in politics. Let's deal with the first of these things that happen, nastiness of campaigns. I remember when I was just getting out of graduate school, and one of my friends, who's now a big Democratic pollster, as a matter of fact, and I were talking in Ann Arbor, and I started complaining about the nastiness of debates, how nasty these campaigns were. He said, "Have you ever looked at the Lincoln-Douglas debates?" I said, "Well, no." And he says, "Well, of course you've heard of it." "Yeah, you know, it's a golden era of political rhetoric." He pulled out a book and he showed me what Lincoln and Douglas and others said about people. I mean, there's some just hair-raising things that were said about our candidates, describing them personally as objects that look like beasts and stuff like that, farm animals. I mean, just crazy stuff. And then, of course, 1960, you had out and out, you know, religious bigotry about the Roman Catholic candidate. And if you look back in when Albert L. Smith was on, there was a retrospective recently I was reading, and they actually recorded some of the things that were said, including in New York, showing houses where the Pope was supposed to come over and live and run the country if he had won. They said, watch the trains, he could be arriving any day. He was talking about the Pope that never made a trip to the United States, I think, till 1968. So this is not, we're laughing about it. This is a seamy underside of American politics and politics in other areas. But if you look back here, and again, look at how wild these swings are back here in this era, up to about the 1950s. And yeah, we've had some what I would call landslides of 10%, but a lot of these campaigns are pretty tight. And look at these ones here. I mean, they're pretty tight. And you're going to have regional religious differences. I mean, if Mitt Romney ends up being the candidate, you are clearly going to see even more discussion about the Mormon religion, and you'll see some bigotry about that. A lot of people think there was unfair treatment of President Obama in the past regarding his religious background. I'm not going to decide that here, but it is clear if you look back in history that things were mean and nasty and underhanded in the past. I don't defend that then, I don't defend it now, but I think Americans weigh that, not always fairly, not always promptly. I don't like it myself, and I try to tune it out if it's unfair, but the other way of looking at what we're saying here is no matter what you say, incorrect, wrong, and no matter how biased the media outlets or who stuffed literature under your door the last, or who sent the unnamed emails to you, or whatever the modern equivalent of that is, voters about 3/4 of the time vote their pocketbook, regardless. And maybe that makes you feel better. And you say, well, no matter what they say about the presidential candidate of my party or of the other party, voters have an unambiguous sense of their own well-being. And they make a decision on that basis. And 21 out of 24 times, it basically comes down pretty much exactly the way you'd think. The second question from former Mayor Logie here about unregulated money in politics. There has been money in politics for so long, and I think, and of course the Citizens United decision comes out of the state of Michigan originally with the Michigan Chamber of Commerce versus Dick Austin decision, I think 1990s, that Bob LeBrand I just saw was involved in that, just retired from the Michigan Chamber. The question about whether organizations can spend money on candidates is going to be around a long time. I, for one, don't think that's going to have a dramatic change in the outcome. I think what it will happen is more money will come in that direction. And if you want to look, you just look at New York Times had the 520 or the new super PACs. There was Democrat super PACs in there. There were big corporations that gave to Democrat-leaning ones and Republican ones. There's always been money in politics. People that will figure out the way to do this better will gain an advantage. What this model says is that no matter what you do, about 3/4 of the election still comes out of pocketbooks. Will there be a bitter fight over the remaining quarter? Absolutely. And people that find out a way to raise the money faster, as President Obama did 4 years ago, as the MoveOn.org people did, they'll gain an advantage. But if you look over there, look at the Obama win, for example, it's not too much different than what we would have predicted if it was just, we just ignored all campaign expenditures. And right now, we're not assuming that it makes any big difference one way or another. Okay. Sandra.
My question to you is about 47% of the public does not pay taxes and income taxes, and how does that affect the pocketbook issues? Because that number appears to be growing in larger percentage, and at some point where you got a lot of people in the wagon and fewer people pulling the wagon. So where does that come up in your equation, and how do you fill that in?
Sandra's question was about 47% of Americans pay no income taxes. You said that so well, you ought to be involved in politics, Sandra. I can see. All right. Actually, I want to talk about that if you look at this, the income tax, I think, was first enacted unconstitutionally back here, and then constitutionally in here, and then it reached extraordinary levels here. And Ronald Reagan used to talk about the movie actors that he knew. They would just say, I'm done making movies because I can't keep any money. And who cut it? Well, John F. Kennedy did. John F. Kennedy was involved in capital gains tax cuts and other tax cuts. And Ronald Reagan cut it right about there. I feel like the weatherman now. Okay. Ronald Reagan cut taxes right over there. There you go, Ellen. And it's still there, right? He's still winning, right? Yeah, okay. So what Sandra's talking about, I think, is a very powerful dynamic if you look inside, a motivation. In fact, we do have a situation now, and Ronald Reagan, the 1986 tax reform is what largely put us here, but we've built on that to the point where you have half of Americans that pay 0 income taxes, 0. They tend to pay Social Security taxes, but they pay 0 income taxes. Does that affect them? I think absolutely, and that's a very valid political issue. I was looking at Mitt Romney's tax return, as a matter of fact, because it was online, and he paid $1.2 million in income taxes last year, and some people said that was unfair, and I said, okay, so you pay $1 million and half the people pay 0, is that unfair? Well, one way of looking at it is it's tremendously unfair because this guy paid $1 million and that person paid nothing. In fact, half of the country paid nothing. The other way to look at it as well is a percentage of his income. We are going to see that as a debate. I think there are other things generationally that'll come up. I think the Social Security, the question was asked earlier, where you now have an impending date where Social Security can no longer pay full benefits. I think that really affects an election in a way that has not happened for a long time. If you remember back in 1980, Ronald Reagan, in the debate with Jimmy Carter, when he said famously, "There you go again," that question was about Social Security. Every presidential debate I have witnessed in my adult lifetime featured Social Security in basically the same way that Jimmy Carter challenged Ronald Reagan. And from 1980 to about 2004, there was a very large demographic group that was voting that felt they're getting benefits that they had paid for, and they completely believed that and they had been promised those benefits. 2008, now 2012, you have a larger and larger demographic group of people that do not believe there is anything there for them. And they have statements that come to them annually that say, we will start running out of money in, I don't know the exact year, but I think 2014 is the year where we actually start taking in more, sending more money out than we take in. And 2025, you can't pay benefits anymore. And that's a collision that's going to happen over the next, 5-10 years, and it will come up this year. And that's a change in the dynamic. And the pocketbook part, again, we put in gross domestic product as our best guess of income. If we got finer at that and looked at what people thought they were going to have in their actual pension and how much taxes they were paying, I think if we had that ability, we'd probably get an even more accurate look at it. Okay? Yes, sir.
I feel like an outsider. You know everybody's name but me, but maybe that's because I'm one of the younger in the crowd. Mayor Logie has opened the door to pulling you out of the rational behavior question, so I have to ask, the unprecedented growth of social media and its effect on emotions, what impact? Is that going to take that 25% and grow it to a larger percentage, or what are your thoughts about that?
Of course, we haven't tested that, and there's no empirical data about that, but here's my best guess. What social media does is let people talk about their emotions faster. It doesn't change their emotions. I can tell you from my firsthand experience with other people that are deeply entrenched in social media that they share their emotions way faster than anyone around them enjoys. And maybe entertaining to them for a while, but I didn't have to turn off too many pagers or text messages before I came up here. But then again, I don't want to share my emotions that fast. Okay, but it doesn't generate something for them. So I mean, really, what you're talking about, you have technology change. We're looking at nearly 100 years of history here. So you look back in the very beginning. I mean, we're barely got telephones and we have some cars. There's no interstate. There's clearly no internet until that near that end of the chart. And still you have 75%. We're actually better at predicting, if you want to get one way of looking at it. We do a modestly good job back here. From about here on, so you have television, you have telephones, and somewhere in here you have internet everywhere. We actually got more accurate. When I say we, I mean voters are closer to a pure pocketbook model. So does that affect it out here? My guess is they're still pocketbook voters. They may get it. They may get their news any of a number of different ways, but they're still going to care about whether they have enough money to buy the latest new electronic device to get that news. And if they do, they're probably going to vote for the incumbent. Yes, sir.
I've got a question that when you talked about the 1980 election, you didn't discuss the third party when Anderson ran, breaking from the Republicans at the time. I'd like to know about that impact, but also how is the global economy now affecting elections, do you think, whether it's Europe or Asia or Latin America? How is that folding into elections in the United States?
Okay, so first question, 1980, third party, John Anderson. And then second about the international economy, globalization. Ellen, do we have I can't remember whether we counted John Anderson as a major third party 1980. We did? Okay. Okay. So we counted John Anderson as a third party candidate. But as you can see, I mean, the economy was terrible in 1980. You had a recession, but you had inflation that was extremely high for Americans, and unemployment was high for Americans. High unemployment, high inflation, economy's not doing better. Third party or fourth party, you are voting for a change. And John Anderson, John Anderson was a liberal Republican. He chose to jump off and run as a third party candidate, I think with the governor of Wisconsin, wasn't it? I can't remember that. I stumped Gleaves. All right, it doesn't happen very often, so I had to savor it. It wasn't as that big of an effect. There was a lot of debate over whether he should be part of debates with Carter and everything like that. It was very clear to voters. Voters, what this model says, and the results say, is that basically most presidential elections are referendum on the incumbent. And the dominant issue is how they handled the economy. And is the economic performance better? In 1980, the answer was no. We're worse off. Are you better today than you were 4 years ago? And Ronald Reagan is the ultimate pocketbook politician with that line. He's probably got the best line in the history of recent presidential debates. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? He asked this question, and at that point, it really didn't matter whether John Anderson was in the room or not. Most people said, no, I'm not, and they voted with Reagan. Second part, you asked about globalization. We are taking into account here people's income, at least as measured by the gross domestic product of the United States. So we, in fact, are taking into account trade. If you think globalization, international trade is, as Ross Perot put it, that giant sucking sound, if you think it's bad, well, however you think about it, if you have a job and your income growth is good, you probably voted with the incumbent, and that's how we've modeled it. If you don't have a job, whether you blame it on international trade or not, you probably didn't vote with the incumbent, and that's how we modeled it there too. Yes, sir.
Try to stay on message. Thinking about the pocketbooks of young people and what it costs to go to school and the cost to finance that education, does that bode well for one incumbent versus the other?
That is a good question, and actually it comes back to Sandra's question about the relatively recent phenomenon of only about 50% of Americans paying income taxes, and also the Social Security dynamic where you have a larger and larger demographic group that doesn't believe they have benefits that are going to be there for them. It's only a fairly recent phenomenon that you had a very large cohort of people that A, voted, and B, were either in college or recently out and had a lot of student debt. And I think that demographic is in fact getting bigger as a share of the whole electoral pie. And I think that is going to affect increasingly how candidates pitch their messages and who they go after. And I think Obama's trip to the University of Michigan very recently and his announcement again, I think this week, about promising more help for students and education, higher education, is an indication of paying attention to that. But the real question is, in terms of what we're doing, is there in fact economic growth and jobs out there? And what our model is saying, at least going back, is that if there's jobs out there and you're a college student or you're about to graduate and you look out and you see the economy's going and you think you're going to have a job, this suggests you're more likely to vote with the incumbent. If you are about to graduate and there's no jobs out there, or you don't see any jobs, and you think that inflation is eating away at whatever your stipend is, and your parents aren't able to support you, and you're having trouble finding a summer position, then you're likely to vote for whoever the challenger is. And I think that's going to continue to be the situation, although you'll see more marketing to the college demographic because it's becoming more important.